Good day, Professor Rambukwella. Thank you for agreeing to do the discussion about your book, The Politics and Poetics of Authenticity, in English as well. Because one thing I noticed in the last discussion I did, that there were more people who had watched your interview in English than in Sinhala. So it does show that even though the original writing is in English, there is quite a lot of interest in hearing the writer speak and the discussions that we construct over a particular issue. So that is why I thought, even though the book is in English, I'm going to speak to you about it in English as well. I'll start with actually the language issue that we started the Sinhala discussion as well, because this is a book in which you give us the journey that the concept of authenticity had done in pre-colonial and independent times, pre-independence, independence and post-independence time, right up to the present. This book came out in 2018. So in fact, you start with the very recent event of Kishani Jayasinghe being tackled for singing Danwa Budunge in an operatic style. So that the question of authenticity is very much a current issue. It informs all our lives in everyday ways. So before we get into the book itself, I like to speak about the question of whether these kind of discussions are actually being carried on in Sinhala, simply because even the difference between nationality and ethnic identity does not have a word in Sinhala. We say Jatiya when we mean both nation and the ethnic group. And my problem with that is, if you go back to Socio and the claim he made that reality is linguistic, that if we don't have a word, we don't have a concept, right? So if we don't have a concept that differentiates between race or ethnic origin and nation, are we kind of in a quagmire, or are we in some complicated situation with regard to Sinhala language and the speakers, though it's not necessarily connected to your book, it's connected to the issue that you're raising. So can we just start with this language issue?
Yeah, so I think if a certain word doesn't exist in a certain language, I guess you can take that as an indication that the concept is also absent to some extent. Of course, that is not always true, because there could be other similar meanings. So which is why in I invoke the Sinhala term apekama to talk about authenticity. But yeah, nation and nationalism and the idea of the nation state, all of these are what we call modern ideas. You know, they come with modernity, the European Renaissance, and also the birth of nation states in Europe. And then these ideas are transported to contexts like ours through basically through colonial influence, and then later get appropriated and reproduced in our societies. So there is an element of sort of cultural mistranslation and mistransfer also in all of this. So that's one of the reasons we don't have these terms. But I think politically and culturally, the important point here, though, is that we tend to look back on the nation as something, and the nation state itself as something that has existed from time immemorial, as something that has existed from antiquity. But that is clearly not the case. When you look at history critically, you realize this is not the case. This is not to see themselves as Sinhala or Tamil or whatever kind of identity that you had in pre-colonial times, but these identities become configured and they gain a certain kind of value after the influence of colonialism that they didn't have in pre-colonial times. So
yes,
I think that is what we need to
yes, Professor Rambukwella, I remember when I first realized that the concept of the casual word is country. You know, we did not even have countries till the 18th century. That Italy, you know, Greece or UK or America or Sri Lanka, India, that these countries came into being as nations, right? Only after the 18th, 19th century was quite a shock, because my question was, what was there before? Because for us to even get out of that paradigm of not thinking in terms of nations or countries is difficult. And it struck me then we had empires, no? And then we had empires based on religion, like the Roman Empire. So that we forget, one of the issues that these discussions are necessary is that what we live in now is not necessarily the way the world was before. And we tend to forget that. And that's the thing that is, it's significant that we remember how things were also, right? And you bring up this very interesting point. You say the nation state, therefore, existed. For example, India was created by the British. India did not exist till, well, in a real sense, Bangladesh and Pakistan, of course, but India itself was just a conglomerate, like a conglomerate of kingdoms controlled by kings. And when the British people came, they actually got the kings to sign away their rights to come under British administration. And I think there's an anecdote of one king signing and just dropping down dead through heart attack. Right? So even for, I don't think even Indians realize that India itself was created by the British.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in a way, this is one of the problems with the nationalist imagination, is that it imagines itself as being very ancient and hoary, etc., but forgets its astonishing youth. It's actually very, very, all nations are quite, modern nation states are quite youthful. The term country, I think I am not very sure of the etymology, but country has, I think, perhaps other local meanings also. And it's much later that it became sort of expanded to include the nation state.
Correct. Low country, like up country. Yes.
Yeah.
Even in our
country. Country is like a locality,
yes.
if you like.
Yeah.
So something like that. I think the important thing about nation states is that today it has become a very normal thing. We all tend to think of ourselves, I mean, even if we imagine the world map, we see independent nation states immediately in our mind. But the reality is that the borders of these nation states simply didn't exist in the same way pre, say, 19th century, Europe or any part of the world. And as you rightly said about India, the subcontinental India was governed as a single unit by the British colonial authorities, so which included what is modern Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, as well as Afghanistan. So it was much later, with independence in 1947, that the British the India-Pakistan division occurs. The infamous McMahon line is drawn, and the two states are divided, and then later on there is a war of independence between Pakistan and Bangladesh in the 1970s, and Bangladesh is even younger, and the state of Bangladesh comes into being. It used to be West Pakistan and East Pakistan. So I think this is one of the problems that happens with nationalism, and in Sri Lanka it takes a particularly different shape also because we are an island. Sujit Sivasundaram, the sort of wonderful historian from Sri Lanka, who's based in Oxford, talks about, he has a book called Island, and he talks about how this island imagination kind of comes to Sri Lanka in the 19th century, and how it shapes the way we look at the territory like a bounded territory. And just to sort of add to this, we spoke about this in Sinhala as well, pre-colonial polities or pre-colonial kingdoms were organized in a very different way politically. Stanley Tambaya talks about the concept of the galactic polity. So he basically says, kingdoms were like the solar system in a way, with a centrally very strong kingdom and other smaller kingdoms kind of orbiting that central kingdom. And there were times when the central kingdom lost its power and influence, and then these lesser kingdoms would then drift away towards the influence of another kingdom, and that kingdom may not necessarily have been inside the Sri Lankan territory. So there were Sri Lankan kings who gave their allegiance to South Indian kingdoms as well. So it was a very different world, and then also I think a very simple example. Nobody carried a ID card like this right back then. which states your, ethnicity, etc., etc. So identity was not institutionalized the way it is today. So,
right. And there was an interesting case you made about, again, coloniality, because you said somehow we've taken the Western concept of the nation to be normative. And now they look at our process of being a nation, India, with the problems with Pakistan, and the murders and the killing, and the South Asian creation of the nation, they seem to consider aberrations, because the concept of the nation, the constructing of it, necessarily is outsider, insider. No, it's punitive. It keeps some people out to consider this is our nation, right? And you have said they've kind of forgotten, and I think you've quoted Renan that they've kind of forgotten that their own creation of nations were probably equally terrible, right? But they've kind of, because it happened long time ago and not in the 20th century, they kind of issue these very moralistic things like, okay, this is not the way it should be.
Yeah, so that's correct. I mean, of course, in careful academic scholarship, like you take the work of somebody like Benedict Anderson, they were always very, very critically conscious of this. But when it is translated into general, say, sort of international relations discourse or anything like that, or even human rights discourse in some instances, tends to see our nationalisms in the formerly colonized world, South Asia, Latin America, etc., as somehow aberrant, more violent, more exclusionary, compared to the so-called sort of mature democracies of Europe, North America, etc. But as you rightly say, all nations, states were founded on histories of violence and exclusion. So one of, I guess, the fundamental problems of the nation-state imagination we have today is that the self-identity of the nation-states often gets defined against another community, or what we call the other. There's always an other to the self. So we need, I think, a different cultural imagination, a different political imagination that transcends that kind of division. And the scholar you mentioned, Ernest Renan, Frenchman, who was one of the first to theorize nationalism, and he has this seminal essay called "What is a Nation?" And he talks about forgetting as a fundamental part of how a modern nation state comes into being, because there are uncomfortable memories that have to be forgotten, suppressed, before the nation state can say, we are one wonderful family.
Yes, that question of erasure, leaving out, forgetting as a part of history, that's a different, completely different, but very significant discourse we should be having sometime in the future. And what you have done in this book, Professor Rambukwella, was to take nation not as as you have said, not as an analytical unit, but as a practically, how have people constructed this nation, and that you're looking at it in practical terms, which gives you the chance of looking at grassroots level happenings, which created it. And you look specifically at this sense of authenticity. In Sinhala, you have called it apekama. And you have looked at how valid or how potent a symbol it had been in the Sri Lankan or the specifically Sinhala journey of constructing a nation. And you've done it through three personalities, two extremely they're considered national heroes, Dharmapala and SWRD Bandaranayake. And you've analyzed their lives to see how they have held on to this concept of authenticity. It happened because of a historical accident. Because of the British colonization, there were families who were kind of a comprador class. They were schooled in British thought, British philosophy, even British education systems. Bandaranayake went to Oxford to study, and only the wealthiest, classiest people could go there, and who were part of the British system. And then, because of universal suffrage coming into Sri Lanka in 1931, I think. 1931, is it, Professor?
Yeah.
Yeah. In that, suddenly, if you wanted to stay as a national leader, you had to get the votes of a huge number of people who you had to claim to represent. And then they had to imagine the lifestyles of those people. And that is where the Apekama comes in, agrarian, paddy cultivating with the way, the lake and the Dagaba, Babadagaba, and how this had to be done if you had to fashion yourself into a leader. So this is the case of Bandaranayake. And that's the feeling that if universal suffrage hadn't come, maybe the trajectory would have been different. And Bandaranayake has been among those people who first opposed universal suffrage and said, please restrict voting only to the educated and the wealthy. And when that wasn't granted, and how this concept had to be manipulated for him to fashion himself a leader. Shall we start discussing him first? You have discussed him second, but let's in our discussion start with him.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, in the book, as you said, I have three main figures. Two of them I call father figures. That's Anagarika Dharmapala, the late 19th and early 20th century religious reformer and social activist. And then S.W.R.D. Bandaranayake, they are the fourth Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. They are the two people that I consider as father figures. And Gunadasa Amarasekara is, I mean, I don't place in the same line, but as a very influential Sinhala writer who has enormous influence in constructing this idea about a Sinhala nationalist narrative and a kind of an unbroken line of Sinhala nationalist consciousness. So that's the reason I picked.
Yeah, and you said Amarasekara played a very big role in putting these two as father figures as well, I think.
Yes.
Somewhere.
Yes. I mean, not him alone, but he played a major role in that movement in post-independence Sri Lanka. So yeah, I mean, Bandaranayake is a interesting character, and yes, in a way, it is 1931 and the and the coming of universal franchise that in a way forces the elite of that time, the political elite, to engage in mass-based politics. Before that, there was no such need. And that in turn creates the need to kind of indigenize their identities politically so that they could go before the people and say, we are legitimate representatives, vote for us, kind of thing. But the need for indigenousness, the need to excavate your local culture, understand it better, etc., predates that. But I think it gains a political dynamic, a political value with the coming of universal franchise. Not that it didn't exist before that, but it gains a very different dynamic in the 1930s. And there's a term that was used back then because there was this rash of conversions into Buddhism by elite politicians who came from sort of Christian anglicized backgrounds, and they were called Donomo Buddhists. It was a disparaging term, and the term Donomo Buddhist was used to imply that, because of the changes the Donomo Commission made, all these people converted to Buddhism.
Yeah, I don't think people are aware that Bandaranayake was born a Christian. Not many must be aware of that because he's such a representative of the Sinhala Buddhist, the value system.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, S.W.R.D. Bandaranayake came from a very sort of anglicized, anglophone kind of background, and even if you just look at his name, Solomon West Ridgway Dias Bandaranayake, Solomon West Ridgway are three names of former governors, British governors of Sri Lanka, and his father gave those names deliberately to Bandaranayake to sort of give that sort of British legacy to him. So it was a very conscious decision. And then he was educated at home by a British tutor, a personal tutor. He only went to school much later to St. Thomas's, but that also for a brief period. And then he went to Oxford. So he comes from a very kind of an anglicized background. And in fact, if people are interested in a really colorful and insightful account of S.W.R.D. Bandaranayake, there are two books. One is James Mayner's The Expedient Utopia, which is one of the best political biographies written in this country, I think, about any political figure. And Yasmin Gunaratne, who is related to the Bandaranaike family, has a book called Relative Merits. And she's punning on the term relative. It's a very clever book. And it has sort of very intimate information about the Bandaranaike, extended Bandaranaike family, which also shows its cultural hybridity. It did not, and it does not derive from this sort of, kind of pure kind of cultural heritage.
One thing, Professor, that you have analyzed the Oxford memoirs of Bandaranaike to show that he could never really leave, no matter how much he presented himself as a representative of the masses, he could never really leave the value system of who is a perfect British gentleman. Because you say even the memoirs, though he's acutely aware of racism and how they look down upon him, his way of fighting back is to somehow belong even more than an Englishman to that value system. And though he is fighting back, it's never at a point where he's fighting back the system of British civility, right? And what bothers me here, and this is something I keep saying, I don't think any one of us, even in 2022, has escaped that. Most of us, even if you look at some of our advertisement, we seem to find validity in being accepted by a white person, right? I've been screaming about an advertisement that I think English tuition, I don't know, some school runs, and this girl speaks in English and these white people come and pat their heads and it's all very hunky-dory. She's very proud. So we haven't, our validity comes to the white man's gaze on us. And now, as well as the time of Bandaranaike. So these are enduring legacies, I think, and that's the danger.
Yeah, I think, it's in a lot of post-colonial societies, these kinds of colonial hangovers have not completely left us. But of course, while we talk about this critically, we have to also look at it sympathetically to any of these figures, because when you put them in their own historical context, their entire cultural universe was formed by what they were taught and what they could see around them, right? So when Bandaranaike, the young Bandaranaike, goes to Oxford as the scion of a very privileged family here from one of the top elite families in Sri Lanka, suddenly in Oxford he finds himself nobody. And then there's this scene in his Oxford memoirs where he's sitting in the common room, the student common room, and I can't remember this Englishman, I think later on went to become a famous politician in England as well. He walks into the common room and he's sort of greeted with in a way that Bandaranaike then says, okay, my ambition is to be greeted like that man before I leave this place. And of course, Bandaranaike sort of writes his memoir in a way to show how he achieves that ambition. And in a way, the memoirs are also anticipating his political role later. He says, so in a way it shows how sort of what kind of fortitude he had, what kind of courage he had, and what sort of how skilled he was in a way. But it also shows how, during that time, affirmation from British culture that you were civilized, that you were intelligent, that you met, sort of you measured up to that mark was important. And as you rightly say, I think in some ways, we are still addressing as a kind of an absent father figure in a lot of our cultures. Colonialism has long ended, and even the cultural sort of structures that informed it in those countries have also long disappeared. But we still feel that injury, that colonial injury, that that our cultures were degraded, that we were considered less than them, etc. So whenever, even say we win a cricket match against a Western nation, there's this huge outflowing of pride. Oh, we beat you all against the odds. So that's why I said we have to understand it. It's not as if I don't share this either. I think I do have it, but we have to understand critically the sources of where this comes from. And the more pernicious side of this is within our societies. within sort of the classist hierarchy, we sometimes still tend to use these very, very problematic sort of measurements about ability to speak in English or to behave in certain ways as indicators of a person's civility, education, or whatever. But actually, though, none of those things are real. They actually carry no real validity. Civility lies in how you treat other human beings, not in the way you speak or dress. So,
as you rightly pointed, you and I and everybody else, you're all caught within the system. So though we discourse about it, it doesn't mean, as we ended our Sinhala conversation, we are very much part of that system. And as English teachers, as an ESL teacher, we have to be extremely careful. Like, for example, if you take my career, that we make this clear to our students, that what we are trying to give them, the baggage that came with it. Because simply to try and give English to an adult, for me, I think it works better when they also have an idea of these things, how we got it, how we are part of the system. So these discussions within my channel called Athramadiya, which is dedicated to making people's English better, these are vital discussions within that context as well, right? And I want to, before we leave Bandaranayake, his representation as he's molding himself as a representative of the masses, as you say, use this authenticity concept, because we had to create what was authentic, because he actually had no idea, because he never grew up in that system. And even the Dharmapala, nor did he, because he was very much Colombo based. He was, within a trading family and wealthy family. So when they had to talk about representing the masses, is that why the imaginary of authenticity came? And did it have no parallel reality out there, Professor Rambukwella? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think, notions of indigenousness, authenticity existed in society in various ways. So when these politicians wanted to create an image for themselves as being authentic or indigenous, they turned to what they saw as markers of authenticity. So one obvious one was language. So Bandaranayake, and I think we have to give him full credit for that, learned Sinhala as an adult and became a very, very fluent orator in Sinhala. Right? But at the same time, his relationship to the Sinhala language and culture, I would argue, always remained somewhat tangential. Because now things like the Hela Howler, in fact, he was aware of it. He was even part of it. He was even part of the membership for a while, I think. But he never took up that cause. Whereas for Munidasa Kumaratunga, I think it was a much more passionate kind of engagement with the language. So I think Bandaranayake, and which is why in a way Mena calls him an expedient utopian. So he was expedient in some of the decisions he made, but he had a utopian imagination. So Sinhala language for him was then a vehicle to gain political power, rather than some deep affective love for Sinhala language or culture. This is my reading. I mean, others may disagree with this, but from my own sort of reading of his memoirs, other material, this is how I see it. So, yeah. Your mic.
Sorry, yes. His decision there affected our future quite significantly, because I don't think we ever got over the 1956 decision of making it, Sinhala only act. Mainly not because Sinhala was made the official language. I don't think anyone would have a problem with that, but because it was only Sinhala. And they kind of forgot that the appeal first came with both races. And a very interesting thing that you point out here was, at the beginning, Bandaranayake was very much for having Tamil and Sinhala, and it was in fact J.R. Jayawardena who opposed it from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. That's such an interesting thing to think, because the whole gamut of this thing falls on Bandaranayake and not Jayawardena.
Yeah.
Right? But you're saying, no, Bandaranayake made that decision maybe 1 or 2 years before the election.
Yeah.
But from the beginning, J.R. Jayawardena objected to that. And the reason which you give is a sense of beleaguerment within the Sinhala nation of having been unfairly treated. And here you put Buddhism and Sinhala language, simply because we've been called, and again you give that quote, a majority with a minority complex. That if you look at it from a region, Sinhala would be a minority language because Tamil speakers have Tamil in South India as well. Do you want to just speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this narrative of beleaguerment, I think, is not unique to just Sri Lanka. Many post-colonial societies have this, and even if you look at our neighboring India and Hindutva and Hindu nationalism, it's in many ways very similar. So the idea is that under colonial rule, it is the majority community that suffered more than anyone else. And it was their culture, it was their language that suffered. And therefore, in independence, in a way, the task of the state itself becomes the addressing of that historical injustice and injury. But the ethical problem there is that minority communities also equally suffered under colonialism. But that recognition is lacking. And I think I mean, it's a cautious comparison I make because even Gandhi's legacy has been severely criticized and reassessed in India today. But I think relatively compared to Sri Lanka, Gandhi was much more inclusive. He was able to fashion a movement where, you know, because I mean, Muslims, Hindus, people of oppressed castes, everybody could rally around the movement he gathered. And unfortunately, it didn't translate.
That's the thing, and it's ironic, Professor Rambukwella, that they were both killed.
Yeah.
You know, so what overtook them was something that they couldn't control.
Yeah.
So it is interesting.
I mean, Bandaranayaka's killing, there is historically the jury is out there. Why
Absolutely.
he was killed, etc.
Totally. Yes.
So
yes.
I think it's perhaps too not simplistic, but too direct to say it was ideology or politics that killed it. There
Probably not.
Anecdotally,
it can even be a very petty, monetary reason. So yeah, those are like not very pretty things or noble things to even concentrate on. Then therefore, I think not even discussed much. We only don't know he was killed. So to move into the other character of Dharmapala, and there was never, though you say it's almost impossible to think that Bandaranaike would not have known about Dharmapala and what he spoke of. They addressed two different stratas of society. Dharmapala, of course, preceded Bandaranaike a couple of years, and Dharmapala spoke to the masses, right? And the people that Bandaranaike was saying he wanted to represent. So Bandaranaike spoke to the elite people because that was where he could fashion himself first as a Congress, Ceylon National Congress person, and then he, by taking the Sinhala only course in 1956, he could completely overrun the UNP, which had been in power where the Ceylon National Congress became. So he actually started a political party, which, it's still till very recent times was very, very powerful. And let's stepping back in time and going back into Dharmapala, you've done a very interesting thing. You said Dharmapala had a moral issue. Not so much that he objected to colonialism, he objected to the impurities like alcoholism and drink that the colonialists brought. So just like Bandaranaike, who did not question British etiquette, civility as being the pinnacle, nor did Dharmapala. He just wanted to show that do not take the impurities, so-called impurities that the West brought, that his thing was moralistic. Yeah. Well, as Bandaranaike was political.
Yeah, so I mean, Dharmapala was essentially a social reformer and a religious activist. So, and to try and read him as a politician is problematic for many reasons. One is the historical social context in which Dharmapala operated was very different to the 20th century and into the mid-20th century. So even ideas of the nation and nation state had not taken such root in society at the time Dharmapala was operating. And he never openly objected to British colonialism. If you look at his letters, etc., what he was objecting to was more, I mean, the crown, the power of the crown, the authority of the crown was something that he accepted. But within that, he was also arguing that the Sinhalese needed to be given the place they deserve in this society. So that kind of majoritarian imagination was clearly there. And also the other issue was Buddhism, and elevating Buddhism, which he was a passionate advocate for. So I think, Stephen Kemper, the American anthropologist, has a fascinating book on Dharmapala, which actually predates my book by a few years, where the title is Dharmapala Rescued from the Nation. And, you have to rescue him from the nation in a way, because what happens is both sort of liberal scholarship, which is sort of anti-Sinhala nationalist, also looks at Dharmapala from a very one-dimensional view and tries to say, here is this sort of Sinhala Buddhist zealot. From the other end, from the Sinhala nationalist end also, you sort of try to reconstruct him as this national hero. He was neither.
You bring out the complexity of his character very well, because you say at one point the point you make is authenticity itself was a very protean concept. It changed according to context. So when Dharmapala went to speak about transnational Buddhism and speak within that context, like in Chicago, he was addressing as a universalist kind of person. But when he spoke in Ceylon, maybe not that.
Yeah.
That they are even like Bandaranaike, they changed it according to the context they were speaking. And they say like Dharmapala was at the beginning, very influenced by the Theosophists, like Colonel Alcott and Madame Blavatsky. But he actually broke away from Colonel Alcott simply because he became a particularist within the Sinhala Buddhist religion and gave up the universalist idea. So therefore he fell out with Colonel Alcott as well. And then we know of his work in India, where he got the Mahabodhi site to belong to the Buddhist people. So because of that, he's, given the obviously and rightly given a hero status here. But that if you look at him carefully, there were so many complications in that character, how he wasn't just one thing. So this brings us to the question of homogenization. Am I pronouncing it correct, Professor Rambukwella?
Yeah.
That we tend to forget the divisions that can exist within a person, within a race, ethnic group, within a concept even, which is necessary for nation building. I think that we forget the divisiveness that can exist. So Dharmapala is also considered as this one blockade. And one interesting thing you bring out is, his, you have said his most direct objections were against the Moors. Right? And in Sinhala, he calls them, I think, even Hambayo. So like, it's a degrading term. And that could be, one of the reasons could be that he also belonged to a trading family. And it could be economics, because the Moors were the biggest threat for Sinhala traders. They were extremely skilled in their craft. So that part of that could be economic, where they say, don't come, this is our territory. Could also be because of trade.
Yeah, I think, this is also theoretically what you call political economy. Politics is not devoid of economic realities. So when Bandaranaike looked at, particularly with the Sri Lankan Tamil community, he really didn't have a problem. But like most Sinhala leaders of that time, he did have a problem with the migrant Tamil labor from South India. So even A. Gunasinghe, who's considered a very progressive, leftist kind of person who built the trade union movement in the country, still had issues with the migrant Tamil labor. And in fact, they had a newspaper which was called Veera or something, and that newspaper was used to kind of stigmatize that migrant labor. As you rightly said, and even within the Moor community, it was this other sort of very specific community called the Coast Moors, who were more recent arrivals.
Traders, yes.
In Sri Lanka, who engaged in trading. There were sort of Muslim communities that had been there for long, and I think people like Bandaranaike distinguish between those communities as well. So I think, yeah, and as you rightly say, even today when we talk about identity, we like to homogenize, put people into neat boxes, and then, okay, shelve them there, that's who they are.
And one
then deal with them like
yes,
that.
one thing we need to discuss, which is important for the present, is the lines of divisions that we operate, thinking they're natural now, may not be the lines of divisions that existed before. And one significant and quite shocking example is one of the first people to have asked for federalism, which you called almost a dirty word in Sinhala, was the Kandyan Sinhala people who wanted a separate state to separate them from the low country Sinhalese. So that even a concept as political as federalism wasn't first ethnically divided. It was on region.
Yeah.
So that we forget where the lines of division had been. And if you take the Tamil community, I believe that caste was such a divisive thing among themselves. And I've heard that there were people who burnt down schools, Tamil people who burnt down Tamil schools, which allowed low caste people to sit with the high class. And people like Charan have, spoken about the Tamil revival movement that Arumugam Navala did, is not exactly a Tamil movement as such, but a Vellala movement, a Tamil Vellala movement. And that he wasn't speaking about plantation Tamils or anything. So that, when we go into war, when we fight, one of the first things that has to be done is to consider one side as being homogeneous. And now we forget, not really. Now the divisions are ethnic, but it wasn't necessarily so. And I think you gave an example of voting happening on caste also.
Yeah, so I think, not just within communities, caste was actually a discourse that kind of united the elite groups across ethnic divisions. 1912, there was an election for the Legislative Council seat for the educated Ceylonese. And there were candidates from the Sinhala community was a Karawa Sinhala person, and from the Tamil community there was a Vellala Tamil person, and the Sinhala Goigama elite actually backed the Tamil Vellala candidate and not the Sinhala Karawa person, because caste was more important as a social division back then. And I think when we go back further to like the Kandyan kingdom and the fact that we had Nayakar kings from the Nayakar dynasty in South India was also made possible because of caste, because it was the succession crisis emerged in the Kandyan kingdom because the king didn't have a legitimate child. And rather than have a low caste person occupy the throne, the Kandyan elite then brought this South Indian line of kinship.
Right. So these things are not much normally discussed. And I think one significant thing that you attach to Dharmapala is that Ananda Guruge's hagiography doesn't talk about his last line of when he died, what he told about Sri Lanka.
Yeah. So that's very interesting because in the 1960s, I forget the exact year, a collection of Anagarika Dharmapala's work, written work, is published under the title Return to Righteousness, and this is edited by the Buddhist studies scholar Ananda Guruge, Professor Ananda Guruge, I think. The introduction Guruge provides for the book attempts to construct Dharmapala as a kind of a heroic figure. But ironically, Dharmapala's dying wish was to be reborn in India as a Buddhist missionary and to fulfill the work he had started in sort of recovering Buddhism in India, not necessarily to be reborn in Sri Lanka. But that line is edited out in Guruge's introduction, and that's a deliberate omission. So that because that is kind of an uncomfortable truth that would disturb that narrative.
Exactly. So the narratives we write now fit the context we live in now very often. And anything that dislocates our way of seeing the world is either erased or not spoken about. So that's again something that concerns history. So Professor, to move to the third person, and the third person is different in the sense that he's still living and he's a writer. He's not a politician. He's not a social activist. Of course, he has now become quite a political person, but not in active politics as such, through writing. And you named that chapter very interestingly, The Life and Death of Authenticity, because I think Gunadasa Amarasekara, being the third character you deal with, talk about how the authenticity of the authentic ideal also died. And a beautiful short story, which I used to love when I was a child, was Gal Pilimaya Saha Bol Pilimaya, where he symbolically thinks the Galpilime is a real authenticity and the Bolpilime is the false authenticity. He never even considers the fact that maybe the Galpilime also was a constructed authenticity. He doesn't go there, right? But what he does with the Bolpilime is to talk about how politics has used it in current, very modern Sri Lankan 70s, 80s, and with the Gamudawa. And an actual fact is that Premadasa used replicas of these statues for all the Gamudavas who actually had Bolpilima. And this being placed in a very sacred Polonnaruwa site, the poor caretaker is confused now because people come and worship the gold painted. So that kind of thing, how he got politics involved in and allegorized it in a short story is beautiful. Can we talk about that depth of authenticity that he refers to?
Yeah, so I think, one part of my book is sort of historical and political. The other part of the book is also trying to see the very central role and culture that culture and aesthetics have played in fashioning Sinhala nationalist ideas and in carrying these ideas into society at large. And I think that's where writers like Gunadasa Amarasekara are very, very important. Now, Amarasekara didn't do this alone, obviously. He was part of a much broader movement in Sinhala literature and culture, which emerges in the 50s and continues well into the 1980s. I just pick him because he's one of the most prominent representatives of that movement. And then he provides a particularly rich site or rich kind of figure on which to discuss these issues.
And he has about seven novel series. I think, I'm not sure that the number is 7, where he Gamanaka Mula, Gamanaka Mada, and whatever Inimagi Halata, where he allegorizes his own perhaps journey through a post-colonial country and then finally finding an answer which he thinks is correct. So everything he documents.
Yeah, so it's like a grand narrative about the emergence of a Sinhala middle class and also like a Sinhala national consciousness. And I think the most critical book in that series is Ganaduru Mediyama Arunalu Dakimi. In the darkness of the dawn, I see the rays of light. So it's a book about hope and also as well. So yeah, to sort of sum it up and to say this briefly, by the death of authenticity, I mean that a very carefully nurtured discourse about Sinhala culture, particularly so-called Sambhavya or high culture, which was visible in different forms of cultural expression. So whether it's theater, film, writing, song, it was visible in different forms, goes into a kind of crisis by the 1980s. And part of that crisis, and the latter half of the 1980s decade was a time of sort of grave social and political and economic crisis in this country. We know that the second JVP insurrection happened between 87 and 89, and there was a huge amount of violence unleashed to suppress that. Then the Indian peacekeeping force arrives in the country, and politically within the United National Party also there's a succession crisis with basically Ranasinghe Premadasa kind of almost forcefully grabbing the nomination for the executive presidency. So a whole host of factors, but the most critical change is what happens in 1978 with the change over to a more neoliberal or what we call the free economy, because that takes away the monopoly of the state in terms of cultural dissemination. Up to then, mass cultural media were very tightly controlled by the state. So take television, take radio, these are very, very strongly controlled. But with that sort of the loosening of the economy, different forms of cultural expression become available. One is the so-called cassette culture, the proliferation of cassettes and the rise of popular culture within that. So I would roughly say, 80s is when sort of popular culture comes into its own in Sri Lanka. And that in a way threatens the dominance of this sort of classical Sinhala cultural discourse that had been maintained very carefully over all this time. And even people like not just Amarasekara, even people like Edrivira Sarachandra were very worried about the influence.
Professor, this is not particularly Sri Lankan, is it? With postmodernism and everything, all the old bastions of high culture, the Arnoldian kind of Lewis kind of thing broke apart. Because with postmodernism, that was what was attacked. The bastions of power, the cultural bastions of power was, after postmodernism, you couldn't even use high culture without blushing.
Yeah.
You still can't.
Yeah.
So in a way, we are part of a global trend as well.
Yeah. I think the globe, I mean, we are very much a part of a global trend, but globally, I mean, particularly if you look at European societies, this happened much, much earlier. By the 60s, 70s, it had completely happened. And I think the critical difference here is that how closely, I mean, I don't have sufficient time to go into all of that, but how closely that idea of a kind of a particular Sinhala culture, a classical Sinhala culture, was tied to nationalism and to the state. That was not necessarily a feature in many other countries. That is, I think, in some ways unique to Sri Lanka. And so when this cultural form, what I call authenticity, dies, I mean, the term dies I use a little ironically also because nothing actually dies completely. It's still with us in other ways, but it goes into crisis in the late 80s. And with that, the Sinhala nationalist narrative, which kind of wrote on that, also goes into a kind of crisis. And the story that you spoke about, Vinodasa Amarasekara's Bolpilime Sagalpilime, the hollow statue and the stone statue, captures that kind of existential crisis, I think, very, very pithily. I highlight that story because I think no other story captures it as well as it does.
And the example, going about it to high culture and low culture, the Jyotipala example, you know, Kemadasa was considered this kind of high culture person who said Jyotipala is one of the best singers we have. So he also, like, we were getting things broken even by the high culture people, and that's how Sarachandan, and you were speaking about Jyotipala's funeral also, right? And the Abunukam article related to
so
that.
There was a very interesting cultural debate that starts with the death of Jyotipala in 1987, and incidentally, he died almost while singing at a Gamudawa stage. He basically steps down from the stage and has a massive heart attack. It was the Ranasinghe Premadasa presidency and the Gamudawa in a way that gave Jyotipala kind of a national stage which had been denied to him before. I mean, he was already extremely popular. He had sung thousands, literally thousands of songs for in cinema, and you know, very, very popular. But with the Gamudawa, he was given almost like a state endorsement as well. So with this death, Sarath Amunudana, who was a very keen observer of culture, writes an article to this cinema magazine called Vichitra, where he says the fall of a cultural pillar, or Sanskritika Balakamuka Bindavatina, which sets off a major debate because Amunudama argues, you know, the thousands who thronged to the Borella cemetery for Jyotipala's death is an indication that, you know, the kind of cultural discourse that Sinhala intellectuals and literary personalities had built from the 50s is no longer attractive to the masses. It is Jyotipala and the popular culture that he signifies that is now relevant, and we as intellectuals also now should be paying serious attention to this. This attracts all kinds of criticism from various people, Reggie Sirivardhana, A.J. Gunawardhana, I think Edrivira Sarachandra himself, Ajit Samaranayaka.
And this debate was in Sinhala or English, Professor Rambukwella?
It was in Sinhala, and very interestingly, it was carried out in a magazine called Arthika Vimasana, the economic review, published by the Bank of Sinhala. But it was edited by Tisarini Gunasinghe.
Ajit Samaranayaka and Reggie Sirivardhana argued in Sinhala?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Ajit was able to, I mean, Ajit later on carried it out in English, also brought it to the island newspaper as well.
Okay.
I think, I think maybe not Reggie, but Ajit definitely wrote in Sinhala as well.
Okay. So the complexity of that, you know, popular culture was looked down upon by the so-called high culturalists, Sambhavya Sangeeta, because in a way it was classist, right?
Yeah.
The popular culture wasn't. The incident that started off your story shows the incredible complexity of the lines being drawn. Kishani Jayasinghe sang Danno Budunge in an operatic voice, and opera is connected with high culture.
Yeah.
But she got hammered by the so-called authentic artists, the defenders of authenticity in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And so they're not like, you even to think it's too complicated, you know, what happened there kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the division was not just about high culture and low culture, but also about what was authentic and inauthentic.
Right.
And then how that marked. I mean, I use the 2016 example of Danno Budunge as a sort of an anecdote that allows us to enter this.
Yeah, and I think art and music specifically, if you take the name changing that has gone on, even Sarat Chandra or Amaradeva, you know, the name changes, how even the artists fashion themselves on authenticity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's quite part of it.
But there, of course, again, we have to be, I think, cautious. That was not necessarily a political move. It was about becoming more indigenous, right? And they may not have done it in any sense. I mean, particularly Edrivira Sarachandra, who I think, if I may be wrong on this, but renamed Boniface Pereira as Ravindra Ramdeniya, and then Albert Pereira became Amaradeva. I mean, Sarachandra was not a political figure at all. In fact, I mean, his book Kalpana Loke, he actually makes a huge defense of the arts, saying, no, arts is a domain that does not need politics. And leftist critics like Kirti Balasurya and Sucharita Kamlat actually attacks him because of that, right? But my argument, though, is they may not be consciously political, but all of these sort of indigenizing movements carries some kind of political relevance when we step back from them and look at the larger view and how they contributed to the discourse.
Because even politics, you can take it as party politics, or the others, everything is political.
No, because I need to make this consciously clear, because particularly people from that period, people from my father's generation listening to what I am saying, will actually object to this, and they would say, no, how can you say Martin Wickramasinghe was a nationalist or Sarat Chandra was a nationalist? That's like ridiculous.
I quite understand, because I think the terms have changed, the definitions have changed, and the framework within we discuss maybe as theory may not even be comprehensible to maybe people of an earlier generation. So therefore we sound ridiculous unless you're within that framework. And I also think that is one of the unfair things, where we expect them to know the current definitions. Yeah. They may be too old, or they may not, that may not have been their discipline.
Yeah.
But they might
also, I think also their insights are also important, because there are people who lived through that period, right? And they have an affective, emotional understanding. And I think if we are cultural historians, we also have a duty to try and enter into that mindset and imagine what was going on, while we might be looking at it from a very different critical perspective, to try and also imagine what was happening. So, I mean, I have always maintained this now. Nationalism is an easy target for criticism. But what I try to do in this book is also to look at these nationalist figures with some degree of empathy. Understand what is motivating them, understand. I don't necessarily agree with anything they have to say, but at least try and figure out what is driving them, what is animating them. Because it's always easy to say, like, oh, you know, these nationalists are sort of extremists, you know, bad people. We don't need to listen to them. Kind of.
Harshana, going back to the name changing thing, wasn't Dharmapal also very involved in this name changing thing, or because you have not mentioned with regard to him at all?
Yeah, but, I mean, because he was Don Hemavitarana, he changes his name as well.
And and maybe got others, which I don't know. I remember this.
I don't know whether he influenced others, but possibly he did.
I remember this. I'm quite wrong. It's from fiction. Kaushalya Kumarasinghe's Nimnagi Itihasya. Right. It's epic novel. Has an incident where Dharmapal is coming to talk, and this beautiful woman is there, and he asks Umbe Nama Mokadda, and she gives a Janet or something, and they say Adina Umbe Nama Siryavati. Right. I was wondering whether that was whether he took it. I find Nimnagi Itihasya to be very anthropological, apart from being good fiction. Yeah. So You hadn't mentioned that part in Dharmapala at all.
No,
So I
yeah,
was
yeah,
wondering.
true. Yeah, no, that I mean, changing names, becoming more indigenous was a, as you say, I mean, it was a much broader movement which happened not just in Sri Lanka, all across the post-colonial world. And you can understand that in terms of the cultural politics of the time. And that cannot be directly tied to nationalist politics as we understand it today.
Exactly, because in the cultural world, it could have been for different many other reasons.
And I think we also have to recognize that the cultural world has a certain autonomy from the political world. Though they are interconnected, there is also some kind of autonomy as well.
Right, except that in Sinhala fiction, the start of Sinhala fiction, I think, is very closely connected to the movement of nationalism.
Yeah.
Sinhala with
yeah.
Exactly. So in that incident, in that point of time, I think Sinhala fiction, the start of Sinhala fiction till maybe Gamperaliya, was very much part of the nationalist movement, I think. And Harshana, just good to end this, going back to what you said, it's about empathy, it's about knowledge. Because I think these kinds of discussions, what we are missing, even in a backlash we might get, is that what we are asking for is a nuanced look at everything.
Yeah.
That maybe you look back and think of the complications only, because it's very easy if you don't have the knowledge of how things happen. You can't boast of perfect knowledge, nor can I, because everyone is in a subjective position. But what you're asking in this book, or what you're actually showing or giving us, is the complexity of things that we take like at a very linear kind of fashion. And you say, no, there's also this and that. And I think that is all what knowledge is.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would very much agree with that. And also, if you think of the role of a teacher or a scholar in today's society, we are no longer these fonts of knowledge, because this instrument gives an enormous degree of power to a student. A student can easily Google and access a vast storehouse of knowledge that, and some of the things that we say could be questioned. So I think what is important here, as you rightly said, is what I am trying with the book also is to encourage a certain kind of critical orientation towards our history, towards what we call legacies. And just permit me to say one more thing about, I mean, a scholar that I admire very much, Edward Said. He talks about his critical orientation as what he calls affiliation. So he says there is filiation. Filiation is like a filial duty. So you belong to a certain culture, you belong to a certain identity, you sort of kind of bow down to it and say, oh, this is, and venerate it. He says, no, that is not the position of a critical scholar. You have to have a position where you have 1 foot outside of that culture, 1 foot in that culture, and you, so that you can critically look at it. So you have affiliation. You're not filial, but you are affiliated. So that's why the empathy part comes. You don't stand as a complete outsider and kind of completely critique it all.
But Harshana, you also, sorry, Professor Rambukwella, you also mentioned that since maybe the 80s, after, the 83, which changed everybody, and after ethnicity became the ruling passion in the war, that scholars also could not be affiliated anymore. There was affiliation expected from them.
Yeah.
So that if you did not toe the filial line, you could be traitorous, or and you give the example of the Ralph Gunawardena Keno Dharmadasa debate, where Ralph Gunawardena says now we have scholars backing ideological positions.
Yeah.
So that it's very complicated when you're in a process of war, for example.
Yeah, I mean, in a conflictual society, the luxury of sort of pure scholarship or scholarship for the sake of scholarship simply does not exist, because everything you say will have some kind of political resonance in society and it will be interpreted politically in some way. So you can't claim that you're ideologically neutral. It's no longer something that is available.
And even if you think you are, some things you say might be easily considered traitorous, and that's a danger. I think probably any scholar who wants to remain neutral runs.
Yeah.
Because to be neutral is not to agree to fundamentalist positions. Yeah. And that just not here anywhere. And then the question is whether you be silent or whether you toe the political line Or, then the choices come and then.
And also, I think neutrality in a way is not necessary. I think what is perhaps necessary is that we explicitly acknowledge that we have a subjective involvement in what we do. I mean, I'm talking to you now. I wrote this book because I have an interest in this subject. It's not just, I mean, yes, partly it's professional, it's what I do for a living, but there is also something very emotional involvement. I'm also trying to kind of figure out my own place in this society as somebody who grew up in a Sinhala and Buddhist background, but who is also quite comfortable talking in English, listening to English music, appreciating English culture or Western culture, whatever you want to call it. So how do I then, define my own identity in this society?
Right. So let's end by saying the same way we ended your article discussion. So it's a critical process, self-reflection. You judge your own positioning in history.
Yeah.
And then you're critical. So the critical ability is what we ended the conversation about the article, because even this book ends on that call. Yes. You're saying there are no answers. You don't know any, there are no answers really in education. All we can do, and if we do it well, is to raise the right questions. Yeah. That people then start thinking, so that you can read it and disagree and then still shout whatever you want to shout. Yeah. But the responsibility is that you learn before you shout. But there's a difference between learning and shouting and simply shouting.
And also answers are dangerous, I think, because answers means they come with authority.
Yes, exactly.
This is the truth, this is a lie.
Yeah.
So I think it's better if we can all reconfigure our minds to live in what you have titled these programs as well, Ataramadhyana, kind of an intermediate space.
I know.
It's not easy, but
it's not easy because
sometimes
Harshana, I think what we have to remember is it's easier if everybody thinks that way. If we just call upon one ethnic community to be like this and the other community is not, then again there are problems. There will be people asking, why tell us? Why don't you tell them? And this is a very common question, no? So that and what they don't see is even within those communities, the scholars are exactly saying that. Yeah. But whether scholars get listened to is a different thing. Yeah. Because what comes in all the media are not the nuanced analysts. Yeah. What comes in the media, the quick, soundbite people. Yeah. So that this is why even the conversation again, this took honestly, Harshana, another hour. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I think
so we should stop. But what I'm saying is, discussion like that won't be sound bites. Yeah. It is necessarily long. So whether people watch it at this length is not an issue, but anyone who wants to actually educate themselves on some issue will watch it. Yeah. But the fact is, it's our responsibility as education is to have it out there. Yeah. Because what I fear is that some of these discussions, knowledge, Harshana, the knowledge that is available on the phone, it still may not be the nuanced one.
No.
These discussions don't normally come on YouTube. No. So that is why I'm so grateful that people do come and speak at length. I think the Sinhala one was 1.5 hours. This went to 1 hour, right? It's okay. Somebody who wants to get educated on this subject can come and listen. We have left it out there. Yes. So whether it gets views or not is not an issue. The availability is our responsibility. So I'm so glad, Professor Rambukwella, that you did come, and that I'm immensely glad that you could discourse in both Sinhala and English, because we need to get the discourses out. I wish I knew Tamil because I'd have done it in Tamil as well. One of the tragedies of our upbringing as we became bilingual, not trilingual, right? Horribly, most of us are monolingual. So let's try to change it. And that's what all this, I'm trying to at least in a little way do it in this channel. So thank you again. We need to stop because there is no stopping here, but we need to have some kind of ending. I'm extremely grateful for your time, both for perhaps the last month. You've been so generous with your time and your knowledge. And I really, on behalf of everyone who is listening, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me.